Y'all, Wizard101 just put out a gigantic raid. There are tons of things to talk about with this specific update. I think a lot of people always have a lot of questions every time a raid drops. I thought today I'd go through everything you need to know about the raid and what's so different about this update. To start off, this raid, at least the first version of it in test room anyways, was way easier than previous raids that we've ever had. The Voracious Void raid, which drops the Void gear and the Nullity gear that a lot of people like for PvE, this took about 3 days of test run for people to beat. The Crying Sky raid, meanwhile, did not get beaten in test run, and it took many months after test run went into live for anyone to beat it. You would think this new raid would be somewhere in the middle, but no, in just a few hours, the first guild had already beaten this raid in test run. Now, I have a feeling that does mean that the difficulty is probably going to increase. That's just something to expect. There's no point putting out a raid that's supposed to be a cornerstone of this update if it's that easily beatable. But I do think it's really telling that the difficulty that they started on anyways is not as crazy as Crying Sky raid, which a lot of people said was too hard. Now let's talk about the gear, right? I feel like the gear is probably why people are going to farm this, other than maybe the first time experience. And honestly, much like previous raids, I feel like there's only a couple of pieces of gear that I would say are really worth farming for, at least right now at level 170. All of the Athames and rings, I don't know if this is intentional or not, because it looks crazy, they all give up HP. So I'm not really convinced that any of these are worth running. All of the demonic and the unreal set, right, from this new raid, all of them give up HP as part of their template. I think that's just not worth the trade-off. The amulets are also a little weird. The ones that give a circle and a triangle jewel, which are the jewels that you want on an amulet because you want the offense on the circle jewel, they give very low res, even though the item cards are super goated. And the amulets they do give res, instead of having a circle jewel, have a tear socket, meaning you're basically, yes, you're getting a lot of resist, but then you're just giving up either 6 pierce or like 10 damage, which means it's not worth it. Even the decks, which are pretty damn dope, if you genuinely like don't want to raid, you could always get a deck that instead of HP gives block, which is arguably better from the new key bosses. I looked through all of this gear, and the only gear that I think I would super consider switching over to is the Unreal hat, because you keep a power pin and you also get a lot of resist, especially if you're a resist school. And definitely the demonic robe. This seems to be the best robe for PvE. If you're trying to get like a high damage, high pierce, high shad setup, this is the robe. For a dungeon, to only really drop 2 or 3 pieces of meta gear and be this easy, I do think there needs to be some sort of thing done so that it's something that people actually find themselves coming back to. That being said, I'll be honest, y'all, the overall experience of it, as someone who ran it with a group that you know, I did it with a group of viewers, the VOD is up if y'all want to see it. We did end up beating it the first day. Well, sure, it was easy and whatever, but I think all of that aside, what I really liked was that I truly enjoyed it a ton. There were all kinds of mechanics in this game that we've never seen before. You could like throw cannonballs using cantrips. There were like callbacks to like previous fights that we basically haven't had the bow tied on, right? Like the previous Cabal member. The dialogue was kind of goofy. It wasn't like super serious, which is something that I think when Wiz does right is straight up magical. And it wasn't something that we could figure out in even 1 or 2 runs. It took us well over 4 hours to even get close to beating it. And when we did beat it, it was super close to a loss. So while I do think they're probably gonna up the difficulty, I hope they also take the feedback where people genuinely enjoyed this, because it didn't feel like, you know, you were grinding like Wiz as a job or something. I feel like that element was something that I had in previous raids that I honestly could not care. I don't want that nowadays. Me personally, I'm not here for it. I don't want to feel like getting gear and getting the best stats or any of it. I don't want it to feel like a job. I want it to feel like something I'm just doing with friends or viewers, I guess, in my guild, just having fun. I think my big issue right now is with the quality of the gear, because I feel like there's a gigantic bias towards defensive schools when it comes to like the stuff, because like let's say that you're a school where the shield pin is actually like, you know, something that gives you stats, right? Like life, for example, they're gonna eat this up, right? There's this unreal set, it gives really good resist with shield pins, right? Like life, you have a huge reason to maybe go after this gear. This just looks like the best in slot gear, other than maybe stalker boots. I don't know, I'd have to do a side-by-side. But if you're an offensive school, it almost seems like there's nothing in this, you know, there's almost nothing that I would actively chase by raiding this. I don't even think there's one reward, right? Compared to the Wastelander hat, I'm giving up crit. I'm giving up like 4 damage for 3 pierce, even though pierce is an extremely easy stat for fire to get. And I even lose pip chance, all for, and resist, all for a little bit of pierce. Like, that's a little bit of a crazy trade-off, even for an offensive hat. And alternatively, the resist gear sets, if you're not a resist school, you barely get anything, right? Like compared to the Wastelander hat, I'm getting 1 res, but I'm losing a ton of offense, so I can't even begin to think about using this. What I think they've done a really, really good job of, especially with this update, especially if you guys watched yesterday's video, they've added a lot of ways to get shad gear. They've added a new template, which hopefully will be a regular thing that actually is a very, very good alternative to raid gear. When you do stuff like that, I think it doesn't mean that you have to make the raid gear completely useless. Like, I feel like it's weird that they, one, had an entire year where only raid gear was meta, and then 2, they make a raid where the gear isn't that good, but then the non-raid gear is like really, really competitive. Why can't we just have both is my question. I feel like that's like, you know, I don't think that's a controversial take. I think you should feel rewarded for interacting with raids, but at the same time, you also shouldn't feel like you need to raid in order to PvP. I think both can be true, and so far I've yet to see a combination of those two things. I think another related point that hasn't been brought up in this video, another thing that they did with this update is that they added recipes so that you can open these portals with keys for lower periods of time. Up to now, the norm has been that you make a key and then you have to be with 11 other people for 3 hours. And now they've added keys where it's just 1.5 hours. That's a lot easier to commit to, especially if you're trying to raid with adults, with, you know, jobs, lives, people that they gotta be with, all that stuff. I think they're already taking meaningful steps towards making raids feel like less of a grind. I think the worst combo is the raid feels way too grindy and you feel like you need the gear at any cost. I think both of those things are getting kind of addressed this update. So I feel like they don't have to worry about that element, and maybe they should make better gear so that, you know, people really run this more than a few times on a few schools. All in all, at the very least, they did make the raid a very, very enjoyable dungeon. I think it's a very well-designed dungeon. I think that part I can't really fault them at all. There's some like really cool side bosses. There's like really cool like communication that you have to do that's very different than anything we've seen. I think Wiz is getting a lot better at making challenging, not frustrating, which I think is something that I could easily say they've struggled with in the past. So it's a lot of good signs. I just wish that the gear was better. Obviously, this is a hot take. I'm just speaking my truth. You feel me? That I might feel like, you know, it's a little bit on the easier side, that maybe the gear could be a little bit better. At the end of the day, a lot of people, their association with raids is that it's a barrier of entry and it's way too difficult. But I still can't help but think that there's a middle ground that just hasn't been reached yet, and I'm just saying that in the spirit of honesty. Let me know what you guys think. If you guys watched the raid when we did it, what did you guys think of the dungeon? You can watch the VOD and give me your opinion after watching it too. It's still up. Drop a comment letting me know what you guys think. I look forward to reading all of y'all's comments. As always, if somebody hasn't told you you're awesome today, they doing something wrong. Stay awesome. See y'all soon. And yeah.